Today we're asking, if AI becomes the new podcast search engine, is your podcast ready to be discovered? We'll also spotlight South Africa's innovative The Tswyza Show and round things off with our podcast tool of the week. This is Into the Podverse, innovation, challenges and opportunities in podcasting from an African perspective. My name's Tony Doe. Welcome to the show. Let me tell you about something that happened a few weeks ago. Someone joined the Association of African Podcasters and Voice for Artists WhatsApp community. I'm a founding member. And as we usually do, we ask a simple question. How did you hear about us? Her answer? ChatGPT. Now, I'll be honest. I wasn't expecting that at all. Not Google, not Spotify, not Apple Podcasts, not a friend. ChatGPT. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this probably isn't an isolated incident. It's a glimpse into how people are beginning to search for information. For years, we've assumed that podcast discovery starts inside a podcast app or on Google. You open Spotify and search. You browse Apple Podcasts. You type something into Google. Maybe you stumble across a clip on TikTok or YouTube. That's how we've understood podcast discovery. But what if that assumption is becoming outdated? What if the first place someone goes isn't a search engine or podcast app? What if it's an AI assistant? Instead of searching for a podcast, they simply ask, recommend a podcast about African startups. What's a good Nigerian politics podcast? I'm looking for a travel podcast hosted by Africans. Can you recommend a podcast that teaches podcasting? Think about what happens next. The AI doesn't send them a list of 10,000 podcasts. It curates, it recommends, it explains why a particular show fits the request. And before that listener ever opens Spotify or Apple Podcasts, someone, or rather, something has already influenced their decision. That's a different discovery journey. And I think it's one every podcaster should be paying attention to. Now, here's the interesting part. AI doesn't experience podcasts the way we do. It doesn't put on headphones and listen while driving to work. It understands podcasts through information. It reads your show title, your description, your website, your transcripts, your RSS feed, articles you've written, guest appearances, newsletter archives, interviews, reviews, every digital breadcrumb that explains who you are and what your podcast is about. In other words, AI can't recommend what it doesn't understand. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If someone asked ChatGPT or any AI assistant to recommend podcasts in your niche today, would it understand your podcast well enough to mention it? Or would it skip over you because there simply isn't enough information available? I think this is where podcast optimization is heading. We've talked about SEO, search engine optimization, and maybe it's time to add another phrase to our vocabulary, AI optimization. Just so you know. Now, before you panic and think there's another algorithm to chase, I actually think this is good news. Because most of what AI needs isn't new. It's the stuff we've always been told to do, but often ignore. Let's start with your podcast title. Does it tell people what your show is about? Or is it clever but confusing? A title like The Conversation could mean almost anything. But a subtitle like The Conversation, African Tech, Startups and Digital Culture immediately gives both people and AI valuable context. The same goes for episode titles. Please, let's retire titles like episode 47. Or, you won't believe this. They might create curiosity, but they don't create understanding. Instead, tell people exactly what they're about to hear. If your guest explains how they built a fintech company, say that. If you're discussing microphone techniques, say that. Clarity beats mystery when it comes to discovery. Descriptions matter too, and not just your podcast description. Every episode deserves a proper description. Who is the guest? What questions did you discuss? What topics came up? Which books, companies, countries, or ideas were mentioned? Think of your description as helping someone decide whether to press play. At the same time, you're helping AI understand the conversation. Then there are transcripts. I know, not everyone enjoys creating them. But transcripts have become one of the most valuable assets a podcast can have. A 1-hour episode contains thousands of words, thousands of clues, thousands of opportunities for AI to understand your expertise. And transcripts don't just help AI. They help journalists, researchers, students, people with hearing impairments, even listeners who simply want to find one specific moment in your episode. It's one piece of content serving multiple audiences. Let's also talk about your website. If your entire podcast exists only on Spotify, you're depending on someone else's platform to explain your work. Your website is your digital home. Every episode should have its own page, a detailed description, a transcript if possible, links to resources you mentioned, guest information, related episodes. The more context you provide, the easier it becomes for both humans and machines to understand what you have created. And then there's something many podcasters overlook: your reputation beyond your own podcast. Have you been interviewed elsewhere? Have you written articles? Do you publish a newsletter? Have you spoken at conferences? Do people reference your work? Every one of those becomes another signal that reinforces your expertise. AI doesn't just look at your podcast. It looks at the wider picture. Your podcast is not just audio anymore. It's an information ecosystem around your audio, but your podcast is the center of it. Around it are your website, your newsletter, your guest appearances, your social media, your transcripts, your interviews, your community, and together they all tell a story. And the clearer that story is, the easier it becomes to recommend your work. Now, does this mean AI will replace podcast apps? Of course not. Spotify still has a role. Apple Podcasts still has a role. Pocket Casts, they all do. But I think AI is becoming another front door. And if that's true, then we need to stop thinking only about where we publish. We also now need to think about how we're described. Because AI doesn't discover podcasts by magic, it discovers information. The creators who provide the clearest information will have an advantage. Not because they've gained another algorithm, but because they've made their work easier to understand. The future of podcast discovery may not belong to the loudest podcast. It may belong to the clearest one. So before I go, here's a little homework. Search for your own podcast using your favorite AI assistant, not by title. Describe your niche, describe your audience, describe your expertise. Then see if your podcast appears. If it doesn't, don't be discouraged. Instead, ask yourself one simple question. What information is missing that would help an AI recommend my podcast? The answer to that question might shape your podcast's discoverability over the next few years.
Tswyza ke mandimane a leng desa so ke Tswyza mara majita vele le show ke Tswyza bare ke Tswyza wiser ex-womanizer.
In South Africa, there's a show that's challenging what many of us think a podcast should sound like. It's called the Tswyza Show. Now, it's basically a hip-hop interview podcast, but in practice, it's something entirely different. Imagine a podcast where the host doesn't ask questions in plain English. He raps them. Then the guest doesn't answer normally either. they respond in rhyme. The entire interview becomes a lyrical conversation. Questions, answers, jokes, storytelling, everything flows like a cypher. That's the format. Instead of traditional back and forth, every episode feels like you're listening in on two MCs trading bars while having a genuine conversation. This isn't innovation through expensive technology. It's innovation through format. The episodes themselves are relatively short. Earlier seasons ran for about 7 minutes. You get a few minutes of conversation, then the guest performs one of their songs. Simple, focused, and he knows exactly who it's for. The guest list mixes respected names in South African hip-hop with newer voices, which means every episode is both an interview and a discovery platform. The Tswyza Show isn't trying to compete with long-form interview podcasts. It isn't trying to be another version of Joe Rogan, Joe and Jada, or Drink Champs. Instead, it asks a different question. What if the interview itself became the performance? That's a fascinating design choice because the format naturally creates memorable moments. Guests' personality comes through in their lyricism, their storytelling becomes entertainment, and every episode produces incredibly shareable clips. That's exactly the kind of format thinking more podcasters should pay attention to. Not copying this show, no, but asking themselves, what is my version of this? What is the thing only my podcast can do? Of course, there are trade-offs. If you're not into hip-hop or understand the slang, some of the references may go over your head. And because everything depends on the guest's lyrical ability, the quality can vary. The shorter runtime also means you don't always get the deeper conversations longer podcasts are known for. But that's okay. Every format makes sacrifices. The important thing is knowing which sacrifices you're willing to make to create something distinctive. And that's probably the biggest lesson from the Tswyza Show.
Ke Tswyza ke mandimane a leng descriptive ke Tswyza mara majita vele le show ke Tswyza ba re ke Tswyza wiser ex-womanizer.
One of the hardest things about podcasting isn't recording your first episode, it's actually pressing publish. So here's a tool that's not going to improve your audio, grow your audience, or boost your downloads, but it might make you smile. It's called Podverse. Podverse is a free microsite from Riverside that creates a digital birth certificate for your podcast. Simply enter your podcast name and, depending on the options available, details like your launch date or host name, and it generates a beautifully designed certificate celebrating the birth of your show. You can download it and share it online as a fun announcement that your podcast has officially entered the world. To some, it's a silly gimmick, but I actually think Riverside understands something many podcast tools ignore. Launching a podcast is emotional. You've probably spent weeks or months thinking about the idea, buying equipment, recording, editing, doubting yourself, and re-recording. When episode 1 finally goes live, there's a milestone worth celebrating. Podverse gives creators a small but meaningful way to mark that moment. It's also a clever marketing move. Instead of posting my podcast is live, imagine posting a birth certificate announcing your show's arrival. It's visual, it's different, and it gives people another reason to stop scrolling. For creators launching new podcasts, especially independent podcasters across Africa, where every bit of organic promotion counts, that little extra personality can make a difference. I'd give Podverse 4 out of 5 microphones, because podcasting could do with a little more joy. Sometimes celebrating the journey is just as important as measuring the downloads. So if you've just launched your podcast or know someone who has, generate a birth certificate and enjoy the moment. Visit podverse.riverside.com. The link is in the show notes. That's it for this episode of Into the Podverse. If today's conversation made you think differently about podcast discovery, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with another podcaster, producer, or creator who needs to start preparing for an AI-first discovery landscape. You'll find links to everything mentioned in this episode, including the Tswyza Show and Podverse, in the show notes. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow the show on your favorite podcast app and leave a rating or review. It really does help more people discover the show. You can also subscribe to the Into the Podverse newsletter for deeper insights, practical resources, and analysis of what's shaping podcasting in Africa and around the world. Until next time, I'm Tony Doe.